Hi, everybody. I know we'll have some people joining along the way, but I just want to welcome everyone. I am so glad that you decided to join us this evening. And while I wish I could see all your faces right now, I hope that you are comfortable in your homes, ready for an inspiring conversation tonight. This is our second virtual community conversation. Though you may know that we've been hosting community conversations for the last several years. Typically in person, in order to bring awareness to important topics and just open up the dialogue around mental health. And once this pandemic occurred, we thought, hey, why not continue these conversations? Everybody's getting really used to being on Zoom. And it's a really great way to just continue to provide opportunities to talk about really important topics. So how about I introduce myself? I'm Jenna Velez. I'm the Vice President of External Affairs for MHA Westchester. I'm so thrilled to be joined this evening by Jeanette Fairhurst, who is an MHA board member for the past 2 years, as well as Ginger McLeod. She's an MHA peer specialist. She works as a CASA volunteer. She's done that for the past 4 years and has worked for the last 1.5 years as a peer specialist in some of our programs. So wave hi, Ginger and Jeanette. Can see them at the top.
Hello.
And we will get back to them in just a little bit. So as you saw from the description of the event, this evening is all about priming for growth through adversity, which really just means getting ourselves ready and positioned for this potential. So one of the elements of priming is learning, developing understanding and expectations about what you're likely to experience both during and after experiencing adversity. So to start, I'm going to provide a basic overview of what we know in regards to typical reactions to adversity, and then familiarize you with the topics of resilience and post-traumatic growth. You know, we have a mixed audience tonight. These concepts might be familiar to some, less familiar to others, so we're just going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. And then another element of priming is actually seeing that concept in action, and this is where things are going to get really good tonight. So Ginger and Jeanette, who you just met before, will share their own journeys of their experiences going through adversities in their life and the process of growth that came out of that. Each time I hear them speak, I feel really inspired and hopeful about the potential in every life. And so I hope that you walk away from this evening with that same sense of hope for what's to come, whether you're in the midst of it now. I know people are experiencing a lot of losses right now during this pandemic, whether you already have a lifetime of adversity in your past or whether it's yet to come. So just a few sort of housekeeping logistics before we get started. I already told everybody you can feel free to turn your cameras off just to limit distractions and so you don't have to feel like you're on display if you don't want to be. Also, your microphones are going to be muted. So if you do have a question, please use the chat function. If you look to, should be towards the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little bubble that says chat. So you can type your questions into there. We're going to have an opportunity to answer questions at the end and have more of a dialogue at that point. But please feel free to put your questions in the chat box throughout the presentation and we will get to them at the end. If we get inundated and don't have time, we'll try to answer questions after the presentation as well. So no need to hold them until the end. Last thing I just need to say, this is a virtual community conversation. So if we have any kind of technology snafu, if one of us freezes while we're talking, please just hang in there. Act like you're in a room and the lights just went out and someone's going to take care of it. But I'm hoping that we won't have any of those issues. I just wanted to just say that just in case. You never know what could happen when you're using technology. Okay, so Gabby, you can go ahead and move to the next slide. All right, so as you may or may not know, May is Mental Health Month, and our theme this year is Thrive, and you'll see the graphic right in front of you. So this is the topic that we're going to talk about tonight really touches upon each of the elements in the graphic you see here. And really, we always like to use Mental Health Month as an opportunity. We always want to talk openly about mental health. It's so important that we have these conversations, but particularly during Mental Health Month, We're always looking for opportunities. How can we talk about how people take care of their own wellness and really pay attention to mental health? And so this graphic here is just some of the ways that you can do that are really simple. Simple, not always easy, but so this is something that we want to keep at the forefront of people's minds. And in the current circumstances, there's a lot of people right now who are experiencing distress, the impact of multiple losses, anxiety, depression, maybe even hopelessness. We really want to help raise awareness that this is normal and expected. It does not mean you are destined for a long-lasting negative impact. We want to inspire people that what they're feeling today and in the days ahead is not predictive of what longer-term outcomes will be, and that there are real steps that can be taken now to prepare for growth to occur. Okay, you can move on, Gabby. Thank you. All right, so I just wanted to talk a little bit, we're not going to do too much data, so don't worry, this is the only slide that does that. But just to kind of set the stage a little bit, so what we know is that more than 50% of individuals will experience some sort of trauma in their lifetimes. And I think oftentimes people feel like if you don't want to have a severe trauma reaction or post-traumatic stress disorder, which is something that people are very familiar with, it's a concept that we hear about actually a lot. It's important to know that only 7 to 8% of those people will develop PTSD. So in order to avoid PTSD, you don't necessarily have to avoid trauma, which I think is a really important message for people to hear, because it's a common misperception that in order to avoid post-traumatic stress, you have to avoid trauma altogether. And as we know, that is not in our control. So that would be a really hard message to hear. And what you'll see is that along this curve here, it shows the typical reactions following trauma and adversity. And this is really looking more at not the experience during that adversity, during that trauma, but afterwards. And we know that that the outcomes tend to fall along this sort of bell-shaped curve where, yes, there are a subset of people who will have lasting negative outcomes. The majority of people are going to experience resilience, and we're going to talk more about what that is in just a few minutes. And then there's also a subset of people who will experience what we refer to as post-traumatic growth, which we're also going to talk a little bit more about in just a few minutes. Next slide, Gabby. Okay, so my really fancy graphics here we'll show you are just intended to help you see the difference between resilience and post-traumatic growth. So resilience is, again, remember, this is what most people will experience. So they go through a trauma or an adversity, and they will have a dip in their emotional reactions. Of course they will. That's how our bodies are designed to react to these things. We often find ourselves in a fight or flight mode. That is what we expect to see happen. That's the way we were designed to do that. And so that's very normal. But then they come through that adversity without those lasting negative outcomes. So they really return to their pre-trauma state of functioning where, life is going along and then they have this situation happen. Things get really bad for a while, but then they return and it doesn't mean they're not changed. They're not different, that this, there's no impact at all, but that in terms of their psychological functioning, their physical functioning, they're going to return to essentially what it looked like before that trauma. So with post-traumatic growth, we're actually seeing things improve, and we're going to talk more about what those improvements look like, and then we're going to hear from Jeanette and Ginger their experiences of what that looked like also, but where you actually see a lasting positive change that comes from it. And actually the data and the research show that these changes are long lasting and that they can take place over a lifetime. And I also think it's important to mention that, again, the experience of the distress, the dip that occurs there, that's a necessary component of this. And also there are people who will maybe even be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, they still can experience post-traumatic growth. There is no timeline on this, and people's journeys look very different. So even if you or somebody that you know has had a really hard time getting through a trauma that you experienced, this is always a possibility in the future. And so there's never a point in time in which we say, nope, growth is no longer possible. There's always the possibility for it. So the timeline at the bottom might look a little bit different, but the potential is still there. Next slide. Okay, and so this is what I touched on, but I really want to emphasize this because I don't want this message, anybody to walk away thinking, oh, okay, well, you know, it's possible to experience something really traumatic and just have no impact on me whatsoever. I'm not going to feel anything. I'm going to be fine. I'm just going to, you know, chin up and, you know, brush myself off and keep going. No, actually, there has to be distress in order to experience resilience or post-traumatic growth. It's a necessary component. And in fact, there are studies that show for some people that there's a correlation between the intensity of the distress and then the intensity of the growth that's experienced afterwards. So sometimes the most intense distress leads to the highest or the most growth afterwards. But I also just want to emphasize that it doesn't have to be done alone. So we're going to talk more about that also. Okay, so resilience factors. We want to talk about what are the things that are likely to promote and hinder resilience. So there are some things that we do know. There are things that people are just born with, personality factors, a disposition towards optimism, things like that, that they didn't necessarily do purposefully and that do have an impact in promoting resilience. But we also know that there are things that people can do for this. And so we want to emphasize those as well. So positive social relationships are a huge factor in resilience. And in fact, you can see in studies of children who have experienced adversity that this is sometimes it's just the presence of one stable, nurturing, caring adult in that child's life that can mitigate the impact, the negative impact on their functioning as an adult years later. And it's really just the presence of that one stable, caring adult. So we know that social relationships are a huge factor here. There are also skills that can be taught, cognitive skills, ways to train yourself to look at situations differently and to adopt healthy routines and behaviors that we know are really important in resilience. Also a practice of gratitude. So it doesn't mean that you have to somehow train yourself to be really grateful for all the horrible things or, you know, negative situations that you're in, but that despite that, you can always find that. And that can be a really powerful factor in promoting resilience. And also just feeling your feelings, not pushing them down, not bottling them up, but actually feeling them and knowing that it's okay to do that. So some of the factors that hinder resilience, we know that if somebody has a history of compounding trauma, it's going to be harder for that person. It's not as easy to experience this growth and be resilient when you've had a lot of situations that have been pushing you down throughout your life and make it harder to adopt those healthy routines, think in a different way. Maybe you don't have that social support that we know is so important. Also avoidance of feelings, and this could be, the unhealthy coping skills could be a result of that. So sometimes people try not to feel the negative things that they're feeling because maybe someone told them they're not supposed to, or that that's not good to do. And that could lead to some unhealthy coping skills. It could lead to avoidance and alcohol and drug use or self-harm type behaviors. You can move on, Gabby. Maybe move on again. I just got a blank slide in there. Oh, okay. So you can fill that. Thank you. Okay, so post-traumatic growth. Now, this is the concept, remember, where you go through the adversity, come out, and you actually have growth afterwards. And we find that this actually results from people's attempts to actually construct meaning from what they're going through. So they may look for what some people refer to as silver linings through things. And that sometimes is what propels people towards this growth. It may be that they're really trying to look at their future and know it is not going to look the same as what I thought it was going to be. I'm not going to have that straight line or straight path that I thought I was going to have. And now I have an opportunity to think about, what do I want it to look like, and maybe move in a different, more positive direction. And then also really important is constructing meaning from those experiences. So, and it could be even engaging in special projects or missions, which you'll hear a little bit about later as well from Jeanette, in ways that people look to find meaning or do good or have something good come from what happened. So it's not about looking at the situation differently, but really looking at yourself within the situation and making meaning from it. We can move on. Okay, and then we know that there are 5 domains of post-traumatic growth. So these are the areas that we tend to see the growth in for people who have gone through really adverse experiences. So they may develop an appreciation for life that they didn't have before. Their relationships with others could really, really change as a result of what they went through, and improve in that way. Again, going back to what we talked about before, new possibilities in life. They may find things or learn things about themselves or about the world that they didn't know before, that creates in them this opportunity to do something really different. Personal strength, so just learning about yourself to say, wow, I would have never, if I heard somebody else going through that, I would have said I couldn't survive. I wouldn't even get through it. But I've learned so much about myself and the strength that I have, that I now feel that I could do a lot more than I ever thought I could. And then a lot of people experience a spiritual change as well, which I think both Ginger and Jeanette have referenced as well, where you connect with your spirituality in a different way, that brings real meaning to your life. What do we do now? That's the question. And I think this slide somehow got cut off, but we're going to go through it anyway. So what do we do now? We want to acknowledge and accept what the reality is, right? We want to think about, what is that data we just saw and what's most likely to happen, and really accept that and say, it's okay that whatever I'm experiencing right now, and if we really go back to what we're experiencing currently, the pandemic that we're in, you know, you may be feeling really discouraged, a lot of despair, loneliness, loss, all of that. To be able to say, okay, I'm just going to acknowledge that. I'm going to be with it. I'm going to accept it for what it is, but I'm also going to feel I'm also going to maintain that hope that this isn't what the end is, and that there's growth that can come from this, and start to make meaning from, what do you want this to look like in the future? It doesn't mean that right now you should be, you know, putting pressure on yourself to, you know, do personal growth right now, right? Because that's really hard. A lot of people are just in survival mode right now. So that's not what we're talking about here. It's more that you are, again, that word priming yourself to believe that that is a possibility. And also, we really just want to acknowledge the fact that we want to avoid thinking about this as in, this is your own personal responsibility. So you are the only one who's responsible for doing this, and you can sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps and just do this. No, we also want to encourage people to ask for help and reach out to others, whether that be your social support system or whether that be a mental health professional. That those are really important in this process, and I can't stress that enough. So the message is not, okay, just start thinking differently, just start adopting some new healthy habits while you're in survival mode right now. That's not what we're trying to say, but just give yourself the freedom to believe that's a possibility, and, you know, start thinking about it now. And that's all you could do now. And if it feels really, really hard to do that, which for a lot of people it will, then that's when you reach out and ask for some help. Move on to the next one. Okay, so one of the other things that we want to talk about here is embracing the paradoxes, right? Because what we're talking about is adversity and growth. But the message we want to send is that there are a lot of things that can coexist that are opposing. So you can simultaneously experience grief and gratitude, loss and gain, vulnerability and strength. And that's really important. It is not one or the other. And you actually kind of need both of them. So if you find yourself in a position or someone, you're talking to someone who's in that position where they're, but I don't know, how can I be grateful when I'm experiencing so much loss and grief right now? Okay, well, they can coexist. So can loss and gain. It doesn't mean that what happened to you or what you've gone through is not important or that it loses its meaning. Not at all, but that they can coexist. Okay. You can move on to the next slide. Okay. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Jeanette and Ginger. So I know Jeanette is going to speak first. They're going to share with you a little bit about their journeys. And then afterwards, we're going to have a conversation just to kind of learn more from their experience. Because like we said before, we know that hearing about how other people have done this can really be part of the process of believing that it can happen for you as well. So I'm going to turn it over first to Jeanette.
Hi, thank you very much, Jenna. That was very nice and some great words of wisdom there. I'm Jeanette Fairhurst. I am a associate director of therapeutic antibodies at Regeneron. So I do science for my job. And as Jenna mentioned, I'm on the board of directors for the MHA of Westchester. And all of this is kind of connected as my big event for propelling some growth, post-traumatic growth, has to do with 5 years ago, 5.5 years ago, I lost my 23-year-old daughter to suicide. It was a huge surprise and devastating, but we were able to, as a family, pull together, grieve, and really make things, accept in the way that we could do it, and find a way to, what do we do? So one of the first things I did, interestingly, a couple months after, was I joined a community conversations about suicide. Now our family had been open right away, at services. My company was extremely supportive. My friends were incredibly supportive, old companies. So we were surrounded by a lot of people and a lot of love from family. It was devastating, but, you need to find a way to get through that first part and then get through that second part. And then there's infinite number of parts, but, being able to have a support system that way, that both, work and personal, when you see that kind of support and have that kind of loss, you need to prevent it in others, in my case, and that kind of became a passion, for how can I prevent this? How can I move forward without ignoring that that's what's going on? Because, I have 2 children. When you have 2 children as a mother, you don't forget one and, only focus on the other. So if I focused only on my son who's living, which is wonderful, I am then going to suppress my feelings for my daughter who is gone. But if I focus all my time grieving, as as a choice, then I've given up to living there. So immediately we focused on the living. Um, and, we, we look to maintain part of that and keep moving and in different ways. Um, and one of those ways, as I say, was connecting with MHA. And through that, uh, I started having some connections. And at work, there were individual connections that I was making. People, because we were open talking about, she died by suicide, and the fact that, she had struggled, uh, with depression, but we hadn't known she was suicidal. People opened up to us. So at work, especially, people came up to me and, would share their story. And I would tear up, and I may tear up here. That's why we don't have you on camera, so that it helps me tell my story without getting quite as teary. So, but it's no problem if I do, and it's no problem if you do, because that's what it is. It's an acceptance of that, to, that's part of my life. So it's okay. But we moved forward, doing some work with MHA. I was fortunate to have Barbara Bernstein agree to give a talk, a series of talks for Suicide Awareness Month a few years ago. And through that talk, Regeneron has an employee interest group where you can set up a group and show that you have interest across the company, and get funded to do activities that are for the good of the company, but also for building a community within our company. So we set up a resilience group. So it's called RISE, Resilience is Essential. And that came from a slide from Barbara's presentation, for Safe Talk forum, in order to, how do we get people together to have the permission to feel and communicate that, but not focus on what has happened, to them or around them, but how do you build for that? Maybe you're building your resilience to get back from something. Maybe you're building your resilience for coming to the future. So this is the kind of thing to build. And all of the things that, Jenna had pointed to, a spirituality. I always had a spirituality, but, in my case, besides acceptance, she's in a wonderful place. I see signs of her coming, it's opening my mind that, whether it's from another being or whether it's from my own need to believe that, it makes a difference. I see life, I see, I can enjoy life while I grieve. And, it's finding that balance, but I never would have imagined that I would be a public speaker, but organically, the passion and like Jenna said, the need to make something good come out of this, and even more just to prevent others from going through it, is critical. And by building that resilience in that group, it's helped me through other challenges too. So, it's something that if you start building it, it has its own way of building. And I think that is going to be a way to transition to somebody who has spent an awful lot of time instead of a single event, has really is an amazing source of resilience to talk about post-traumatic growth. So I think Ginger, unless you want something first, Jenna.
No, we can move into that. I do want to ask one question, because I think we'll come back to this later, but what point in your journey did you start to reach out and notice that desire in yourself to make something from what occurred?
That was immediate.
Okay.
Yeah, that was fairly immediate. I think, there was just no question that I couldn't let something happen like this to other people. And what could I do but finding that right thing took some time. And one other thing that that I haven't said too that I think is really important. I also had professional help. I had a great therapist who really helped build and helped my husband build. My husband, it had a different kind of post-traumatic growth in that, some of the paintings you see behind me, I mean, he did all of the paintings behind me. So he changed into a different outlet, so we all do it in a different way.
I was hoping you were going to mention that. I love that.
And it's important for everybody to find their own way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Right. Because I don't think that could be my way. I don't have that kind of talent.
Me neither.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Jeanette. We're going to come back with more questions in a little bit, and let's let Ginger jump in here and share her journey.
Hi, everybody. Jenna, thank you very much for including me in this. I think that there's going to be lots of conversation about trauma and adversity coming out of all of the stuff with COVID. So opening the dialogue about it is really important. My trauma is a little different. Well, it's a lot different from Jeanette's, and God bless, I cannot imagine that particular event. It's probably one of my biggest fears. But my trauma kind of comes in stages. There wasn't one event. There was a series of unusual events that were very impactful. And, I grew up in a very dysfunctional family. I come from a long line of diehard alcoholics, and all of that chaos that comes with that kind of a family structure. It's kind of like being assaulted on a daily basis, because you never know what's going to happen next. So your radar goes up, and I used to, when I was like 5, I used to go up on the hill by my house and just watch the house, because I needed to know that everything was quiet, but I didn't want to be in the house, but I had to be prepared. There are obviously a lot of adverse impacts because of that. And my family didn't have great coping skills. And so as, part of it was also feeling somewhat responsible. It just kind of comes with the territory, is feeling like if I did something differently, it would be all better. And that proved not to be the case. But my way of dealing with it was the family tradition. When I was 14, I started drinking. And, my legs got longer, my waist got smaller, and I was the belle of the ball. And it was the only way I knew how to integrate with other people, because I thought that there was something very wrong with me. There's a lot of trauma that's involved with substance abuse. I OD'd a couple of times, but I was blacking out for years, and all of those things cumulatively are traumatic. And one of the things that I see in 2020 hindsight is that I kind of got numb to adversity. It's like, that's what my life is. It's just a lot of adversity. And, I got married and had a child at 21, totally unprepared. And we were married for about 15 minutes, and I became a single mom. And I was drinking until my daughter turned 12, at which point I was fortunate enough to get into treatment. And fortunately, she got sober when she was 14. So that's one of those silver linings that comes from trauma as well, is that we have a family tradition that I hope my daughter and I can change, that we can kind of stop the perpetuating of that. I also, all of that left me feeling very small, very, you know, it was like, if this stuff is happening to me like that all the time, it must be my fault. It has to be because I'm not worthy. And that ended up getting really beaten into me, literally, because I didn't have I had my first nonviolent relationship when I was 43. And so it's kind of like this continual assault on my psyche. And I have been very fortunate because I grew up at a time when people were starting to understand more about mental health. It was not a talk that anybody ever talked about. It was always whispers behind the back of your hand. And fortunately, I was around as it started opening up more. And, you know, my parents sent me to go get fixed with a psychiatrist starting at the age of 16. And so I've been in therapy for like a long time. And it got to a point when I was intervened on by my boss, and he sent me to treatment. And it was the amount of relief that came with that. And I didn't have any more secrets. I think one of the hardest things about trauma is that we keep what's happening inside us a secret. We don't talk about it either because we don't think we should, or because it's not an appropriate situation. So that kind of, it's a slow wearing away. It kind of erodes your sense of self. And, you know, the best thing of all, as far as I'm concerned, is when the mental health field started asking not what is wrong with you, but what happened to you. Because so much of the mental health challenges are the result of some kind of traumatic impact on your psyche. And so it was very difficult to look in the mirror and get to a point where I could actually believe that it wasn't because I was awful. It was because it was outside of me. It was something that was happening to me, and it was not my fault. I certainly added to it through my own drinking and drugging, but you know, it's giving myself permission to not be terrible was one of the hardest things I had to deal with. So the process of starting to become accepting of the trauma was a slow process, but again, it just opened everything up when I started to talk about it and get some direction from other people who'd been through it. I've been kind of in the peer world for 35 years. I got sober 35 years ago, and you know, that's the part that worked for me, because it was with other people who understood what I was going through. So
so Ginger, would you say that that's the point at which you realized, okay, I know what was helpful to me, now
yes.
This is where I'm going to go? Okay.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, so all of that adversity can feel like, you know, that's all I'm worth. And I got no relief from thinking that way. But what I was able to do was to take all of that adversity and all that trauma and all the help that I got over the years and pass it on to somebody else who is suffering. Trauma can create some self-pity and all those kinds of things. And the one thing I know I can do to help myself is to help somebody else. It gets me out of my own circle, and the ability to say I understand or I know what you're going through is invaluable. And so I'm very grateful that I've had the opportunity to be able to work with people who are going through their own traumas, their own situations. And it turns all of that, all those dark uglies in my life into something really quite wonderful. And through the process of that, I'm able to understand my own value, which was a very difficult thing for me to achieve. And it was that's been the most effective thing for me in terms of recovering from trauma. And each part of my trauma kind of helped me go through the next stage of trauma. So it was a cumulative thing. And I believe that when you can embrace the damage, you can recover yourself, but also help other people recover. And I just have been very fortunate and like to pass it on when I can.
Thank you, Ginger. Thank you for sharing all that. I know that's your passion and that's what you do, but I appreciate it every time. And you know, it's interesting because yes, what I love about the fact that your stories are so different is that there are common elements and threads that are woven throughout them. And it's like pulling them right out of the information that we talked about in the beginning. And that's helpful, right? Because we don't want people to think, well, that's different from what I went through, so this isn't going to happen. That's different from what I went through. My experience is so different. And, you know, the common elements are that you both in your own time felt, okay, it's time to seek something good from this. And, you know, for one of you, it happened immediately. For the other, it took a lot of time to get there. But it was when you started to do that, that was the result, like the result that came from that was the growth. So it wasn't you experienced post-traumatic growth and then you were able to do this stuff. No, it was your efforts and your desire to bring meaning and purpose to what you were going through that actually brought about the growth. And if you think about the different domains of growth as well, you see that you both discovered new possibilities in life. So it really is fantastic to hear both of those. One of the things I heard you both say is that when you started talking about it, that was a big turning point for you. And I know, Jeanette, you said that was pretty immediate. Ginger, for you, that happened later, but it was a powerful experience for both of you, powerful enough that you both mentioned it in your stories. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about what that was like, and were you nervous to do it? Did it feel natural? How did you have those conversations? And how would you encourage someone else to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in our case, I was actually led by my son. My son opened up about it immediately on Facebook. And once he opened up and told the story on Facebook publicly, we all shared it. We all decided that that's what we were going to do, you know. And so it was important to, you know, we could see that, again, that's not the only thing, and it has to be a much longer thing, but by not hiding that and feeling like, you know, that had to be separate, you could start to accept it and work with that. And again, you know, then you realize how many people have been through so many things. I mean, you are surrounded by people that are so much stronger than they know or you know. You know, so it's just you know, it's sharing some of that and allowing, you know, oh, I could never have gone through that. I couldn't have gotten through what Ginger got through. You know, I couldn't do that, you know, but the opposite too. And it's just you know, finding common ground and really just allowing yourself to be human and um, share that we all learn from each other.
Mhm. Mhm. One of my favorite sayings is that a problem shared is a problem halved. When I didn't have to carry all of that in myself and I was able to let some of it out, was very empowering. And you know, there's a saying in AA which is, you're only as sick as your secrets, because those things eat away at you when you can't talk about it or you don't talk about it. For me, part of the problem was figuring out who I could trust to talk to, because there were many times that I talked to people that weren't helpful and it ended up being used against me. And I had to learn to take the time to get someone to know someone, be it professional or otherwise, that it was safe. Safe is a big thing with trauma. It's that feeling of safety that we don't have to start with. I mean, and that's some of the residual that happens now. I can't walk down the street with earphones in. I have to be able to hear and see where I am, and that's just hardwired now. But they're really the freedom of being able to talk about it in a place where people understood what I was talking about. They weren't labeling it, they weren't dissecting it, they were accepting the reality that I was trying to explain, and they listened. Mm-hmm. I wasn't used to having people listen.
Well, we have a great question that I think really ties into this. So, and you're almost answering it without even, I think, knowing that the question was asked. So that's fantastic. You already mentioned that what was really powerful for you was when people started asking not what was wrong with you, but what happened. And yeah, that is so important. But what are some things that helpers, this is a question that we got in the chat box, that helpers inadvertently do but should avoid, and what should helpers do to make the biggest difference? And I think it's important that he used the word helpers also, because it could mean professionals, it could mean, you know, just support people in your life. And you know, we have all kinds of people you know, that are listening to this right now. So what would you tell them about what are things that are helpful? What do we do inadvertently that we, you know, should avoid?
Well, I think one of the biggest obstacles in all of these kinds of challenges is the sin of judgment. And I know that for myself, it was about people listening. And it's the same thing I try to do for other people, is to learn to actually listen. Not to listen so that I have a response to come back with, but to listen, because people, we know who we are and we know what hurts. But if you don't let it unfold, it gets lost. And oftentimes I know for myself that sometimes when someone is hurting, I get so uncomfortable because I want to fix them and I want to alleviate their pain. And that's not helpful, because that ends up being about me. And so I think the listening skills are kind of it sounds like a pat thing, but it's not. It really does take skill to listen to someone And yeah.
Great.
I think in a similar way of that, what are you trying to help? Are you helping to help the person, or are you helping to feel like you're helping?
Yeah.
And, and it's understandable. Everybody wants to help for sure, and it's a way to feel better. But especially, for people who have big losses, especially if you know them well, don't look to that person to be comforting you, first thing. Later on, okay. But, I think, it's important to come to help on their terms, like you said, same kind of thing. Sometimes it's, what can you do to help isn't the most helpful. Just kind of see and listen, and you'll feel how to help. In terms of professionals, if it's in that way, for the big trauma, I think what was so great, with our therapist, I went alone, my husband and I went together, and he went alone. So we would alternate.
Mm-hmm.
And, she was incredibly good at, following the lead. Some questions, some not. And, so we immediately felt, the space was our own, which is the same thing for a good friend is, if I feel like going out to a bar, we had friends who took us to a bar, not long after. First of all, having the courage to ask us to something normal, was bold, but then to accept that I went off to the bathroom to cry at a song that reminded me. One of the friends followed me there, came back. I had to cry there, came back, and sat down again, and didn't make that end the night. So it's like anybody, go with what the person is going with, but as long as it's not harming them. And I think sometimes that's a hard thing. And especially if you're asking, for how to help somebody who's in the midst of a trauma. You may need to get a professional to really do that, but you need to help them know that they need that, I guess.
Do you feel like you learned to listen differently through your experience because of what you went through in a way that you didn't know before?
Yes,
Absolutely.
definitely. But I still have my personality, and I still don't always hear the same thing too. And the most important thing in all of this is be you while you do it. Whatever you brought as a friend is what you bring post and, post trauma too. Try not to change that. Although, some people I always give people the benefit of the doubt, and knowing that whatever I went through a trauma, they may have been through something that my trauma retriggered. So if they didn't come to me for 3 months later, that's fine. I was able to work through that, but I think, that's not always the case. But I think everybody needs to think about the fact that everybody's got something going on, and especially in this time of COVID, as people come back, you have no idea what they've been through during this time. Assume that they've had a hard time. Take turns, listen, share, but always assume that everybody is fragile at the moment, and then you'll be kinder.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize again how how powerful it was that you both talked about the talking element of things, and really encouraging people, don't hold things in, talk to someone, whether it's your journal or your best friend or your mom or your therapist, but talk about it, because That's where this happens. We only have about 5 minutes left. We are getting, I know, I knew it was going to go by so fast. And we are getting some questions. But I actually wanted to get to one more thing too, is just asking you if you could each speak to what we spoke to before about the, how you can experience grief and gratitude at the same time, or vulnerability and strength, and how you see that even today. Because we're talking here about your growth, but I also want to recognize that it doesn't mean that you don't have the other element that's with it as well. So if you could talk a little about that, each of you, quickly, because we only have a few minutes.
Sure. I definitely, still have waves of grief that come, but I also have just beautiful days out, and now I have a wonderful granddaughter. So, there are days that it's difficult to focus on, I don't say focus on the positive, allow yourself to recognize the positive, because if you're trying to focus on the positive, then you're overdoing it and you're going to make it, I'm good, whereas if you're recognizing the positive, you let it come in. And that way it's not a forced thing, but it's organically builds up. And the more you let it come in and recognize it, the more you see it all around you, how good things are.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, but so I'm stuck. What was it?
That's okay. I was just looking at the paradoxes, and if you could speak to those. Yeah, the grief and gratitude, loss and gain. Yeah,
definitely. You can have faith and fear at the same time. You can have you can be sad about something and happy about something else. I mean, we are capable, and like it or not, we have all of the above. And it's a question of for me, it really has it's hugely important for my recovery is my spiritual connection, because with that, then those dichotomies make all the sense in the world to me. And it's not all or nothing. There's like the scales kind of go back and forth, and sometimes I'm sadder or angrier than other times, and sometimes I'm just eternally grateful in spite of all that. I am very grateful for my life. I have learned a lot, and I have learned to understand that I'm a strong person. So, but you can feel two things at the same time, even when they are apparently complete opposites. And for me, it's just about staying connected to something that's larger than me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's really helpful. And I loved that, the recognize the positive instead of focus on the positive. Like, you don't have to get rid of the thing that's hard to recognize. And actually, the other word that you both used when you were sharing your stories, and I think multiple times, was acceptance as well. Yeah. And that's really, that stood out to me also, just in terms of, acceptance doesn't mean saying I'm okay with this, or even with the growth that happens, to say, I still wish it didn't happen.
Yeah. I'd trade it in a second, but that's not the choice I have. And so you do have choices. You may not have the choices you like, but you have good choices. And it's how to find those, and how to let people help you find those.
Yeah. Well, we're getting a lot of thank yous to both of you for sharing your experiences so much. And I know that everybody who's on here is just going to join me in doing that, and thanking you for your vulnerability and sharing such, powerful stories that really are, I think, like I said in the beginning, always give me so much hope, and I hope have done the same for other people. So I really thank you. And I think we could have continued this conversation for a lot longer, and I wish we could have, but I'm going to say to be continued, because we're going to keep doing this. So stay tuned, and I hope you'll join us again when we have our next one. And just want to mention that, if anything that you heard today or that you've been going through, you feel like you need someone to reach out to, we just want to let you know at MHA, we are here for you. We do have clinic services that are still happening. We have therapists who are providing telehealth. We have the number right there that you can see if you feel like you need just someone to talk to. We also have a community connection support line. The number is on the screen in front of you also. This is really for those who maybe just need a friendly conversation, don't have a lot of people to talk to, and just need someone to talk to, but not necessarily experiencing anxiety, depression, or, but maybe just, need someone to talk to. And we all need that sometimes. And not everybody has, a Rolodex full of friends and family. So the community connection support line is really to fill that need also. And, I hope that you'll stay tuned on everything that we have to come, more community conversations, and, stay tuned with what MHA is doing. And we thank you again, everybody, for being a part of this tonight.
And thank you, Jenna.
Thank you, Jenna.
Happy to do it. Okay. Bye, everybody.